The piece was written, of course, in the middle of the 19th century, but it feels to me like early 19th century music in some respects, particularly for me this opening, which does remind me, could almost be from the 18th century, except as I just said, for me, it does have this redolence of some of the turns and some of the more, shall we say, almost operatic sounds that vocal...
Oh yeah, it reminds me of Rossini a lot, actually.
Yes.
To me, it is very operatic.
Absolutely. And yet, at the same time, as it progresses, we then get unmistakably French lines and unmistakably French lyrical colours and those phrases which are so French in their kind of delicacy and restraint. And then at the end, I thought to myself, well, I'll bet you when we get to the end something of fireworks is going to happen, but I wasn't prepared for quite such fireworks. Goodness me, I mean, that's a tremendous piece of tour de force virtuosity at the end. How you bring it off is stunning. And, well, I suppose there must have been players around at the time that the composer hoped would do it.
Yes. I mean, yeah, the ending is terrific fun. And, I mean, today it's like the kind of piece that just is perfect to end a recital program with, because it's just, like you said, it's just fireworks. You know, it's just full of energy and full of character in that piece. You know, it goes from romantic to slightly classical sections. It's a very, very vocal piece, and it's terrific.
I was very impressed how at the end, with the virtuosity, your tone remains warm all the way through. In fact, one of the things that's so interesting about all these various items you've put on is the different kinds of colours and tones you have adapted for the different pieces of music, which I think tells us so much about your background, having studied and listened so much to many forms of classical music. For instance, the next piece of music here, which is so very different, even though it's a French composer, but it's from a different century, much more well-known piece, of course, the Concertina Camera by Ibert. But your tone and colour and whole approach to this is almost like a very, very different instrument. So this is important.
Yes, that really means a lot to me. I appreciate you saying that, because that's one of the things I've admired about so many different singers, is the way they have the flexibility to vary their tone color, vary vibrato, and vary the character of the music through those devices. like some of the musicians I mentioned earlier, like Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, for example. I mean, they can do that so well. And as an instrumentalist, I mean, I just don't see any reason we should think in terms of just being an instrumentalist or just being a saxophonist, but just strive for that same flexibility and that same way of expressing the composer's intentions through any means possible. And I think the saxophone can pull that off and use those, vary the color and do all sorts of things like a singer to help make the piece more effective.
Yes, and I'm sure that's one reason why, when it did come later into the world of jazz, which I have to say is probably the most well-known form of the saxophone, and of course what we're talking about now is this glorious repertoire that is nothing remotely to do with the jazz world, which is less well-known, and this is one of the great values of what you're doing. But just to refer to a minute to tie up what you said, I think one of the reasons it did succeed so well in the world of jazz was that it did become very close as an instrument in that particular genre to the vocal characteristics of jazz, particularly the vocal singers. And this is all really by way of backing up, or if you like, underlining what you're saying about the expressive versatility of this instrument. All the more reason why it's so fascinating to hear in this Iber Concertina Camera how you play with a combination of effortless virtuosity and lightness and refinement, which I feel is what the great French composers, nearly all of them, even right up to the present time, and you even think of Boulez, that there is a refinement, in his music, although it's worlds apart from what we're talking about. This I find very impressive and very interesting, that you have found the refinement in this piece with the virtuosity.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, that's, to me, the Iber is exactly that. It's sort of this combination of virtuosity with refinement. I mean, at all times it sort of maintains this lightness and this delicacy, but at the same time it's virtuosic. And it's just sort of a fine line that you have to sort of go back and forth in between. And going back to what you're saying about the jazz influence, the Iber has a pretty good amount of jazz influence, because it was written in around 1935, when jazz influence was beginning to make its way to Europe, and that's when Iber heard jazz and incorporated these elements into his concertino. So, I mean, in a way, the fact that the saxophone took off in such a big way in the jazz world has made it more popular and made it more heard to composers like Iber, who may not have heard the saxophone and wrote such terrific music for it.
And next I come to another completely different world, one of my favourite composers, Villa-Lobos. Now, the Fantasia for soprano saxophone and the Arime is what I've chosen here. And unmistakably Villa-Lobos, a lovely composer. He's really, apart from the Bacchus Brasileiras, which is so popular, he's awfully neglected, I feel, don't you?
I do. That's interesting that you say he's one of your favorite composers, because he's a composer who wrote just an absolutely tremendous amount of music. I can't remember how many pieces, but it's just, his output was just humongous. And for some reason, I think he's much more deserving. And like you said, his Bacchianas Brasileiras are just beautiful. And I think Villa-Lobos' Fantasia for soprano sax has a lot of influence and a lot of similarities to these Bacchianas pieces. And I think it's just a gorgeous piece that is deserving of a lot more exposure.
He always was very aware, wasn't he, of the folk roots that lay before him in his country. And yet he was, at the same time, a very sophisticated classical writer. And I think that's one of the secrets that's one of the most important facets that one has to be aware of when one's performing him.
That is very, very true. You know, I read this interesting story about Villalobos. He would go through the Amazon, through the rainforest on a raft alone, and he would look for indigenous tribes, and he would record these folk melodies and these rhythms, and he would use these elements and these melodies sometimes literally in his music. That gives us such a uniquely Brazilian sound that is unlike any other composers, because he really took these native rhythms and melodies and incorporated it into his music in such a literal way that gives us such a unique sound. I mean, when you hear Villalobos' music, it just sounds like, sounds like Villalobos. It's so instantly recognizable.
Ashu, you have achieved an enormous amount of success at a very young age with an extremely unusual instrument with which to achieve such success in the world fundamentally of classical music. This is very important, I think. I mean, there's been a lot of important television appearances, solo appearances, concerto appearances. So I think that you are showing us that there is almost, it's like there is an advocacy you have here of your instrument, showing us that it can actually have a repertoire in the solo world that maybe is, I think, somewhat larger than people have imagined, but also particularly through your arrangements. So what about the future? Have you got a plan? Have you got a vision for yourself and for the instrument for the future, how to develop this?
Well, I mean, for me, I just love performing. To me, there's just no feeling in the world, like walking up on stage, seeing an audience out there, the sea of people that just, come to hear you play, come to hear what you have to say. It's just a thrill and it's a high like nothing in the world. And, I just try not to take any performance for granted. I just feel lucky that I get to do this for a living and that I can, perform recitals and concertos and just do that. And, to be honest, I just hope I can keep doing this as long as possible and just perform as much as I can,